they have a history of not paying their workers fairly. They use temporary worker agencies to bring in these workers and exploit the fact that they don't have enough rights to defend themselves.
Right.
They don't hire young people from the neighborhood because they have rights. And this is where Canadian politicians have created a two-tier system. I'm fed up and sick of you. Don't lead me on again. Don't act no more. I feel nothing for you. Just leave me alone.
Hi everyone, I'm Stacey Lee Kong, and this is Friday Talks, Take It to the Group Chat, a video series where I assemble the perfect panel, a group chat in real life, to discuss a particular aspect of the immigrant experience. And today I'm here to talk about money and second-gen immigrants and what it means to succeed in this country with policy analyst and political firebrand Chloe Brown and TMU Associate Professor Rupa Banerjee. Thank you both so much for being here.
Absolutely.
Thank you. So I think the core element of many immigrant experiences is that there's like a contract, right? You uproot your life and you move to this new place and you build in this new environment, and that's all really hard. And you sacrifice cultural connection, and you sacrifice familiarity, and you sacrifice community in some ways. And so the payoff has to be economic freedom, more autonomy, more independence, but times are hard.
Yes.
And right, like times are really hard. So I don't always know, to be fair, if the promise of immigration is fulfilled, even in the best case scenarios. But there are forces at play right now, economic and social and political forces, that make it even harder for that contract to be fulfilled.
Yeah.
And Rupa, this is the crux of your research. Before I even knew that I would be able to talk to you, I found your research really important and affirming. So I was wondering if you can tell us a bit about what you have found about the employment and earnings potential for second-gen racialized people in Canada.
Last year, some colleagues of mine and I undertook a quantitative analysis using census data.
Yeah.
Because the beauty of census data is that it's generalizable. You can actually make statements with that data because it's really big. It actually represents Canadians as a whole. And what we looked at is how second-generation Canadians, so those whose parents were born abroad, but they were born in Canada, how they've been doing and how the cohorts have been changing over time. So we looked at folks who were born between 1966 and 1975, between 1975 and 1985, and then between 85 and 95. So really 3 different cohorts. And what we find is that this dream of the parents for their children seems to be less likely to becoming reality in newer cohorts than in earlier cohorts. So specifically, what we find is that educationally, the education of second generation is getting higher. It's getting higher and higher, even from the 1960s to the 70s to the 80s and 90s cohorts. They're very highly educated. They're more highly educated than Canadian long-term Canadians. But when you actually look at the returns to that education, like once they enter the labor market, they've actually been deteriorating. So it's a very discouraging story that we found. And there was a lot of heterogeneity between ethnic groups as well. And I think that's a really important part of this story, that it's not just about being second generation, it's also specifically about which community you are coming from.
Right. And can you tell us a little bit about like which communities are doing better and which ones are doing worse?
Yeah, so what we find is that Black Canadian second generation experiences quite a precipitous drop in labor market outcomes, even within the cohorts, between the cohorts.
Right.
So, for example, in the 1970s cohorts, people born in the 70s and into the mid 80s, they tended to earn about 25% less than their mainstream white counterparts after you account for education and all those other factors.
Right.
But then when you look at people born in the 90s, that has dropped to a 50% lower earnings after accounting for all of
Education.
those factors like education. So this is really concerning because you essentially see a doubling of the disadvantage among the Black population. It's not just Black Canadians, it's also Latinos and Filipino Canadians as well. When you look at South Asians and Chinese, they also experience a drop, but it's not nearly as precipitous, it's not nearly as large. So I think overall, we have to take a disaggregated approach and think about what is happening within these communities to lead to this kind of negative experiences in the labor market.
So I want to come back to that, but because you've given the research aspect of it and the sort of academic aspect of it, I was hoping, Chloe, that you could talk a little bit about how you see this manifest in your communities. Like, you are involved in so much grassroots work, you're so embedded in various communities. What does this actually look like?
When I was at the City of Toronto in 2015, what this looks like is the summer of the gun. And when we talk about youth violence in the City of Toronto, a lot of the time what we fail to address is that there's a lack of opportunity strategically laid out across Toronto. A really great example that I think about is that in the corridor of Keele, Eglinton, and Finch, 20% of all of Ontario's manufacturing is happening in terms of food, furniture, and pharmaceuticals.
Right.
That area covers Jane and Finch, that has a high youth unemployment rate. And when I think about who is in these workplaces, it's temporary foreign workers. And this is where policy choices to undermine a generation have been really playing out in the streets of Toronto, because one of the large factories in that corridor is Fiera Foods. Fiera Foods has a history of violating foreign worker rights, and they have a history of not paying their workers fairly. They use temporary worker agencies to bring in these workers and exploit the fact that they don't have enough rights to defend themselves.
Right.
They don't hire young people from the neighborhood because they have rights. And this is where Canadian politicians have created a two-tier system of employment to satisfy local businesses at the expense of displacing young employees.
Right.
So unfortunately, we have this youth unemployment issue because politicians want to satisfy business. Businesses think the easiest way to keep their costs down is by exploiting labor. I'm not going to pay you overtime. I'm not going to give you a full-time work contract because that means I would have to give you benefits because that's your right as a Canadian citizen. That issue still creates a bottleneck of registration problems, particularly in unions. When we think about construction unions, a lot of those jobs are being held for young Italian, Portuguese kids whose parents were brought here by the government in the 60s to work those jobs exclusively. And this is where there's a real critical need for understanding ethnicity, community, culture, because a lot of our history as Canadians, you can track communities by the needs of the government, the industrial
And that's
needs.
yes, because we've seen that with Caribbean people. We've
Yes.
seen that time and time again.
The Chinese were brought here for the railroads. They were
Yes.
charged a head tax. Those little things eat into how your families create opportunities. And when you think about a place like Toronto, there's a reason why Chinatown exists.
Right.
There's a reason why Little Italy exists. People were forced into these areas where they were not giving government services, but they had community.
Right.
And this is really at the heart of what's plaguing all of our ethnic communities. North America prioritizes individualism.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And okay, so this kind of dovetails with what I wanted to go back to you. So Rupa, why do you think the disparity that you saw in your research exists? Because I think Chloe explained a lot of it in kind of like really big picture ways, but can you sort of zero in on what you're seeing as well?
Yeah, so what Chloe mentioned is absolutely true. This is a labor market trend more generally than just a second generation issue.
Yes.
This is a youth employment issue. And the proliferation of the temporary foreign worker program is intricately tied in to the high youth unemployment rate. So even if you are a third generation, fourth generation young person coming out of school, you're facing different and more challenging issues than your parents and your grandparents did. But then when you take that and you add to that issues of nepotism, issues of networks and who you know, and how jobs are actually found and who gets the jobs, you still see referrals, employee referrals, basically playing an outsized role in determining who gets into certain sectors.
Right.
And so communities stick to a particular sector oftentimes because of it. And so if your community tends to be in a precarious, low wage, low skill, quote unquote sector, then as a child growing up in that community, you're not going to have the resources to be able to find a professional job that's outside of that precarious sector necessarily. So I see it in my students at TMU.
Right.
I have to say, today, most of my students are actually not white, and almost all of them are either immigrants or the children of immigrants.
Same.
And when I ask them, about their family connections, about what kind of connections their parents would have, or even their parents' friends, they don't have those connections. And it's a real source of stress for them. So I think when you couple this changing labor market, which has become tougher than ever for everyone, with this lack of connections, resources, and networks, it really, really disadvantages those second-generation youth from particular communities. On top of that, we have to talk about racism.
I was just going to say, but
So
let's talk about
the
that.
elephant in the room, right? At the end of the day, there's sometimes an assumption that racism is getting better or has gotten better from the 1970s, 80s, 90s to now. And what our research finds is that maybe not, right? That maybe it's more subtle, maybe it's more hidden, maybe it's not something you talk about openly, but it still operates in very similar ways. And if anything, because of the recent backlash to DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, it has now become more acceptable than ever to actually go back to the old style of open racism.
Right, you get the slurs as well.
Yes.
You get the let's keep you out of these opportunities and also.
Yeah.
Right.
So I think that the racism, discrimination, and internalized bias, which also leads to internalized discrimination within communities themselves.
Of course.
To feel that I'm not worthy
Yeah.
of anything more than this.
Yeah.
Well, because I was going to say, my students, I also have a lot of students that are immigrants or children of immigrants, but also just widely what I'm seeing is this idea of like what kind of jobs we can have. And so what can you aspire to be and what is possible for you? And that feeling of not having anyone else who can guide you or give you advice, or like I didn't have anyone in my family who could tell me about journalism. But I also was becoming a journalist 20 years ago. Like the equation feels very different now.
Absolutely. A really great example of this is like the seasonal farm worker program.
Yeah.
It's staffed by, I don't even want to say staffed. It is predominantly supported by Caribbean, Latin American people who are being pretty much held in slavery conditions because their visa is tied to one employer. They've only changed that recently to give them the freedom to escape bad employers. And one thing that really strikes me about this industry is that they say Canadians don't want these jobs.
Right.
You don't think I want to pick my own food, get my hands dirty? You never asked me.
Right.
And this is where we really do need to talk about how Canadian industries are marketed to different groups.
Right.
Because there's this idea that the reason why immigrants exist in this country is because Canadians don't want to do this job. No, Canadians cannot do these jobs because the wages being offered are not in line with the Canadian law.
Right.
The conditions that you're putting your employees in are illegal under Canadian law. So they created this caste system of immigrants that do not have rights. And this is where legal status is a very important thing when we talk about employment, because as a Canadian born, even if I am Black, you have to treat me the way that the Charter has put forward. If I am an immigrant, if I'm refugee, newcomer, permanent resident even, and I've been here for 5 years, if I don't have citizen beside my name, I am not entitled to legal representation. So this is where, when we talk about the temporary foreign worker program, it is very much designed to undermine Canadian wages and Canadian opportunities, because I know as a Canadian, you cannot disrespect me in a certain way. So you as an employer will go all the way across the world to import someone that you can abuse.
Right.
And this is where we as children of immigrants are currently in this very toxic situation where we're blaming international students for the quality of work.
Absolutely. And I wanted to say, as we're talking about temporary foreign workers, or we're talking about like the disparities, that it's really important to remember that these systems and these policies and these practices are actually making it worse for everyone.
Exactly.
Because there is that impulse or something to look outwards, to like not to look at the system, but to look at the person who is stealing your jobs.
Yes.
Other immigrants are not immune to that way of thinking.
Oh, no, they're not.
Yeah.
I mean, the research has shown that,
Yeah.
actually. When you survey Canadians, including immigrants, people who are not born in Canada, as well as those who were born in Canada, there's no difference in how they feel, the negative kind of emotions they have towards newcomers today. In fact, immigrant communities are some of the most anti-immigrant, anti-newcomer, exactly for the reasons that you talk about, because it's almost designed to be a divide and conquer
Absolutely.
kind of system where there's no solidarity, because essentially you see others as competition for yourself.
Because solidarity undermines the capitalism.
100%.
Yes. And that is really where work and politics become a really necessary arena to create, because a lot of us do not see ourselves as working class.
And that I just to underline this idea that your excellence will not protect you.
No.
You can be excellent, you can be adjacent to whiteness, you can sort of swallow all of the things that you're seeing. It will not change anyone's opinion of you if the opinion is rooted in racism.
Correct. Yeah.
A lot of us don't take a class analysis when we're thinking of certain problems, because racism is truly classism by ethnicity. There is discrimination in every community. As someone who is of Caribbean and Asian heritage, my mom was excluded from a lot of things because her mom is Black and her father is Chinese.
Yeah.
When she came here, she started to realize that there are more people like her that are biracial. And this is where we have to confront, even in our own communities, what classism is. A really obvious example of this is the Uber drivers. Who is doing gig work? The international students who were subsidizing colleges and universities by paying twice as much as the domestic rate of tuition. They're a part of a caste system, even in India. And when they're brought here, they're treated just the same. And this is where, if we don't start talking about class, status, the things that we prioritize in what makes a profession noble, we will fall
Absolutely.
into the same
What is a good
traps.
job?
Yes, we have to have a conversation as individuals about who we elevate to higher statuses, because that impacts how our children feel about themselves. I wouldn't say that this radical racialization is just happening in one community. It's happening in all of our communities. And we need to have an open discussion about it, because when you realize it's being propagated by people who want to protect their wealth and their power,
Yes.
you realize there's a lot more manufactured chaos and division than what's actually happening in the street.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Another
Okay.
point that I think is really important, kind of connecting to what Chloe just said, if you look at the outcomes of second-generation Filipino youth, they face this extra level of layer of barrier because predominantly, oftentimes their mothers came here first, leaving their families behind, and came as caregivers or nurses.
Right.
And that family separation, and then the struggle to reunite and come together in Canada and do well, leaves a lasting scar and a lasting
That's a
legacy.
traumatic
on that.
experience.
Yes, that trauma and class-based trauma
Yes.
and immigration class-based trauma leaves a lasting legacy on their children. So you see families where sometimes they're still living in the basement of their employers when their children come and join them, and they're
Right.
going to the same school.
Right.
And so, I think this This class-centered analysis is super important to understand really what's going on with race and racism in our country.
And just to build off that, a politician was caught holding a nanny hostage.
I do remember.
Yeah.
I do remember.
And this is where it's like, we have to realize it doesn't matter what your race is, it's the class that makes people feel that they can treat people in an inferior way.
Yes. I do want to ask a little bit about the cost, and I feel like we've talked a bit about the economic cost, but I'm curious about your thoughts on the emotional cost of, because for me, not being able to fulfill the dreams that my parents and grandparents have, for me, it's difficult, but also like it doesn't end with me. Like the idea of moving here is to build a better life for your family. It was interesting when you were saying you weren't sure if people really understood the trajectory, because I think the trajectory is actually the thing. Like, I think it is, how do I build a better life for my family, my immediate family? How do I build a better life for my children? But then that needs to continue, right? And so as things get more precarious, as it's harder to find a full-time job that can pay you a decent wage, as it's harder to build a life, that I risk it stopping with me. So there's like a lot of feelings around failure and letting people down. And I'm curious from your perspective, like what is the emotional cost of not being able to attain economically what we thought we would?
So what we know is that immigrants who are unable to use their skills, who are unable to essentially apply their expertise, they are disillusioned, they are discouraged, and more are leaving Canada.
Right.
Okay, but for those who've actually settled and they've had kids here, it becomes very difficult to leave.
Yeah.
And instead, you have families that are disillusioned, disappointed, and not happy. And this has ripple effects not just on the family, but on the community, on the next generation. So I fear that essentially this kind of economic disparity that we're discussing today will essentially divide society even further. And although a lot of second generation kids go to school because their parents kind of expect that of them, I think that they often have this sense of it's futile.
Yeah.
It's futile. They're just almost giving up in some ways. And I think it's a real shame. And I worry about that. Because essentially, if we want a socially cohesive society, this is not the way to do that. It's not the way to build communities that help each other, that actually want to be in Canada and have a positive view of Canada. We talk about that a lot today with the current political kind of context. It's not surprising that fewer and fewer people don't have a positive view of Canada, aren't proud to be Canadian. And I think that that's like something that we should be very concerned about.
Yeah. Okay, so I don't think that we talk about the Canadian dream and the way that the American dream is like this trope, but this is my last question. I want to know, because I think that's what immigrants here are buying into. They are buying into a Canadian dream that is not the same as the American dream, but it is this thing. So what does the idea of the Canadian dream mean to you?
It's funny because it's like the Canadian baby boomer dream is to be a snowbird.
Yes.
You got property here, you fly out for the winter.
Yes.
And that's great. But as I think about the real estate crisis that is affecting my generation of millennials, that's no longer the dream for me. I want to be able to have access to housing wherever I am, apartment, brownstone, whatever. There should be a housing system in place that is built for everyone to use. And this is where the Canadian dream isn't really a real estate portfolio, it's universal access. And it makes me think of Pierre Trudeau, who said, there is no all-American Canadian girl, all-American, all-Canadian boy. All of us with our diverse dreams and desires make a Canadian. And for me, to be honest, like at 35, I've achieved my dream. I have an apartment with one bathroom that I don't share with nobody. I got the dog of my dreams. I graduated post-secondary. I'm living a life that I get to decide. And freedom of choice, while promised, is not what we have here in North America. You have freedom of opinion. And this is where the Canadian dream, for me, is now, I get to choose where I go and when I come back.
Right.
It's not just having a house. It's like if I want to work on a project in Spain, Canada has good enough relations with Spain that I can travel there and I'm not displacing someone. And that's where it's like, I want to be a global citizen, not just Canadian. Because for me, growing up, to be Canadian is to be a global citizen. We should be able to go anywhere and be known by the good works that we do. We're not doing that anymore because we're trying to be Donald Trump's bastard son. Like, we need to aspire to be better. And that's the thing. Like, my Canadian dream is to be better than the circumstances I grew up in. And that's not necessarily owning a mansion. It's having safe shelter, clean water. It's my friends being able to pick up their half of the bill because they're getting paid fairly. And that's like the larger dream for me. Like, I want all my friends to be able to afford the way they want to live. So, yeah.
So like not, and Rupa, I want to hear what your thoughts on the Canadian dream are, but I do think it's very striking that what you're saying is not necessarily that it is a scraping by. It is a good life, a decent life, a life where you can afford leisure, that you can afford joy. Because I think so often when we talk about the kinds of conversations that we're having, they're often about survival. They're often about the bare economic minimum.
Yes, and that's where it's like the Canadian dream has to become community instead of individual.
Right. And Rupa, what about you?
So I have two kids. My daughter is 16 and my son is 11. And to me, the Canadian dream, it resonates with a lot of what you just said, but I think it's for them to feel that they have the freedom of movement, freedom of choice, freedom of expression that essentially my parents dreamed of when they came here, and that they are not othered. I grew up feeling othered. I grew up in the 80s and 90s, really being set aside, right? And so in terms of economic outcomes, you know, I've achieved what I wanted to achieve. I did my PhD, I got a professorship, you know, all those things happened. But it never left me that I have felt set aside. And I'll be honest with you, I don't have many non-immigrant friends or people who are not the children of immigrants as friends. Almost all of my friends are either immigrants themselves or the children of immigrants. And that tells you something. It tells you that we never felt a sense of true belonging in this country. And so for me, the Canadian dream is for my children to not have to feel that, to actually feel they are Canadian, that they have the right to essentially have everything that, you know, a white, long-term, multi-generation Canadian has at their disposal. So that's really the Canadian dream for me.
Thank you both so much. This has been a very thought-provoking conversation. It's like shifted some of the things that I've been thinking, so I'm really grateful to have been able to talk to you. If people want to learn more about you or they want to find you on the internet, where can they do that?
So my social media is Chloe Brown, 4, TO. And I'm on Instagram, TikTok, if that's still legal.
Maybe not by the time we air,
Right.
unfortunately.
I have reels there, check me out. I'm on Facebook, and then my cooperative is called Solidarity in Numbers. sin.coop, COOP. We are gearing up for a community bond campaign where we're raising money to convert food banks into food co-ops. We really want to push this idea that communities can own different parts of the supply chain, and we really want to capture the energy of crowdfunding to make people realize, like, those projects are closer to home than you think. So check us out. I answer my social media every weekend. So if you message me on Monday, I'll get back to you Sunday-ish.
Rupa, what about you?
Honestly, the best way to reach me is through the TMU website. Just look me up, Rupa Banerjee. And all of my information is on there, my email. Email's probably the best way to reach me. I'm a little older than all of you here, so I don't do the TikToks. But
I don't do the TikToks either. I'm just on there all the time.
I'll take your memes, guys.
We'll take memes.
So yeah, that's probably the best way to reach me.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for watching. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to like, comment, and share. And if you would like more Friday in your life, you can follow Friday Things on Instagram @_Friday Things, or you can go to fridaythings.com/subscribe to sign up for the newsletter.
Can't you take a hint?